So we started playing together. I think 3 years ago now, 2.5 years ago, and then Abby is our new member, and she joined in September. And
in September.
Yeah. And
so since lockdown.
Yeah. And we were doing the quartet studio course at the RNCM for a year.
Yeah.
And we just joined the chamber studios, and unfortunately the lockdown happened just after we joined.
Are you in the middle of the RNCM studio?
No, we finished it now.
That's finished, right?
Yeah.
So did you miss some of it because of lockdown? What a pity.
Yeah. I think we missed out on the last kind of 3 or 4 months, but we got lots of great stuff in, I think.
Yeah.
Before it ended, so.
Okay. Good.
Yeah.
And where are you living? Are you in Manchester?
Yeah, we all live in Manchester. Yeah.
Right.
Um.
And may I ask what happened to your previous member?
Well, she actually she lives in London, so she was kind of commuting a lot, and I think the more serious we wanted to make the quartet, the harder it was for her to commit. And
right,
she just, I think, especially once kind of the pandemic happened, she decided it was too much for her, and she wanted to focus more on teaching.
Yes. Yeah. So have you had much opportunity to rehearse in your new formation?
I think we had kind of a month and a half or 2 of seeing each other every day, and it was great. And then unfortunately, the lockdown happened again, and we just thought it's better to wait. But we're going to start again, I think, in like 2 weeks.
Good. Do you have a place? Do you have a place you can rehearse in?
Yeah. We mostly rehearse at kind of each other's houses.
Right.
And we've got a few churches in Manchester that we're in touch with.
Yes, good.
Where we can, and the RNCM have said that we can record or rehearse there as well.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, it's just during lockdown that everything has shut, so it's just been kind of impossible. But
because I know the RNCM actually closed. I think the present studio quartet, what are they called? Freeman, yeah. I mean, I think they were letting them rehearse for a while, but that stopped the last couple of months. I think even for the studio quartet, but so it's been really tricky. But anyway, I mean, if you've basically got your own homes, and it's just a matter of, you know, how comfortable you are mixing and whether you're shielding anybody, and so on. But hopefully now it's beginning to ease. I mean, we're beginning to see progress. So
yeah, hopefully.
I think I just wondering, because I had the vaccine about 4 weeks ago, and it really, I mean, of course we know about vaccines, but it really changes your outlook a bit when you've had it yourself. You kind of believe in it a bit more. But also the figures from Israel, which are a lot ahead of us, are very, very promising in terms of, not only in terms of protecting the people who've had the vaccine, but in terms of, it seems, stopping the virus spreading if you've been vaccinated, which is a huge game changer, I think.
Whoa, yeah, that's massive.
Because I can imagine, you know, audiences again by the autumn, say. And anyway, by the autumn, we will have probably vaccinated all our over 18s. You know, you should have all been vaccinated too. But so, you know, I think it's looking a little bit more optimistic than it has for quite a long time, even though we're still in the middle of a big crisis at the moment. But we can sort of see the end of it, I think. Anyway,
Yeah.
I'm not an epidemiologist, I'm a cellist. What do I know? But just reasons to be optimistic. So do you have any sort of agenda? Do you know what you want to talk to me about?
Yeah, we've been looking into competitions and things, and just trying to make some sort of plan, and trying to apply for as many things that are still sort of having open applications. And yeah, we're just like, some advice on like competition repertoire would be really useful, actually, and just like a chat about that would be really nice.
Yes, sure. I mean, I don't know much about most of the competitions, but I think in general with repertoire, and I don't know whether the competitions allow this. I mean, there's such a huge. I mean, one of the glories of being a quartet is that there's such a huge and great repertoire. I mean, it's so much, speaking as a cellist, or slightly less as a violinist, but as a cellist or a violist, I mean, the sort of richness and the variety of the repertoire is just stunning. And I think it's not like if you're a harpist or a flautist, or or a solo violist or something. There's all these riches, and I think it's very important that the most of your time you're focusing on the great classic repertoire, because first of all it's there, and it's one of the main motivations for playing string quartets, and secondly that's what most music societies and so on are going to ask you for. If you play in most music societies in this country, they might just about tolerate a Bartok quartet in the middle, or even an Ades quartet in the middle, but it's very hard to persuade them to have more than one. And it's very hard to persuade them to have anything that, I mean, this is rather sad to say all this, but that's contemporary, that they haven't heard of, which means it's a nightmare for composers writing for quartets. But that's how it is for you. So I think it's important that you don't spend a lot of time learning stuff which you're only going to play once, because there's so much to learn. And you don't really, I mean, however much you rehearse, you're really not going to feel comfortable playing a Schubert quartet or a Beethoven quartet until you performed it about 10 times. So you will want to do it again and again, and the promoters will want it again and again. So I would use your time, 90% of your time to do basic repertoire. And by that, I include, of course, 20th century classics, Webern and Berg and Bartok and Britten and Tippett and that sort of thing. And there are even, I would say, some contemporary classics. I mean, it's incredible the way we actually commissioned Arcadiana from Tom Addis. I mean, I would say that's a classic now, because about 40 quartets have played it at least. And it's played all the time, and audiences actually, see the name on the program and they don't run away.
Yeah.
So that sort of thing is fine. I'm not saying don't ever do anything. I mean, if you really find a composer you absolutely love and you want to champion it, and I think if you do that sort of thing, it's good to have a relationship with a composer. I mean, so that I would say choose someone who's a bit of a player, or at least has a sympathy for playing, and who can work with you. So you can make suggestions to that composer, and that composer can make suggestions to you. So you influence his or her work, and they influence your work. And I think that's a matter of finding something, because there's nothing more miserable than learning a work which actually you don't have a lot of sympathy with. It's incredibly difficult. It's taking 5 weeks of your time, and you're only going to play it once, and the audience is going to hate it, and you're going to hate it, and then I mean, this is just a completely miserable experience, and there's no need to do that. So some of the competitions that I'm aware of require you to learn a particular piece which has been written for it. Now, sometimes it's the sort of thing where you just have you've just shown the score 48 hours before, and then you have to learn it in that time. I don't particularly like those competitions, but they do it. That's not going to waste much of your time because there's nothing you can do to prepare for it, and it just drives you crazy during those 48 hours. I think putting an emphasis on speed of learning is not particularly helpful for quartets. I don't think there's anything particularly marvelous about being able to do things fast. It's what the results are in the end. And I also think it means for that last 48 hours, you can't really work on all the classic quartets which you've been preparing for months and months. So you've got to be super prepared for those. But we did it when we did our first competition. We had a 48 hours or 24 hours or something to prepare something. It was a piece and it wasn't difficult. It was by Alan Hodinott and it was probably about 12, 14 minutes long. It was a pretty good piece actually, and we actually used it afterwards a little bit. So I mean, I think that's one issue, but I think I would avoid competitions if the repertoire is all incredible, full of stuff that you actually don't really want to learn. I mean, they shouldn't be like that, and I wouldn't want. I don't think it's a well-run competition if it's full of those pieces, because they want to know, how do you play Haydn, how do you play Schubert, how do you play Brahms, and how do you play Bartok, and then maybe okay, how do you play something else? But a lot of them, do focus on the central repertoire. When we did our first competition, and we'd only been going for 2 months, so our whole repertoire of the quartet was based on the competition repertoire, and I would say it was utterly inappropriate for a beginning quartet, but we didn't know that, and nobody gave us any advice. It was Brahms 3 and the harp quartet and Bartok 6 and what was the other one? The last Mozart. I mean, they were very demanding and tricky, and it was the last thing I would suggest a new quartet does. But we survived. We did well in the competition, so I suppose in the end it kind of did us good. But when we almost did too well, because we had a whole stream of concerts, and every night it was just, well, which piece are we not playing tonight? Because we only had 4 pieces, and it was hard to kind of catch that. Anyway, that's just a bit of history of us. Anyway, tell me, what do you think about all that?
So we have, there's a competition in Norway, Trondheim.
Oh yeah.
Which we've been looking at, and they have a very specific requirements for repertoire.
Right.
And we've come up with a fairly big list of pieces that we'd like to choose from. And maybe we could just go over them and yeah.
When is the competition?
September this year.
That's good. So you've got quite a long time. Yeah.
Yes. So we've recently been working on Mendelssohn Opus 13 and Haydn Opus 76 number 1, G major.
Yeah.
And Janacek Kreutzer Sonata. So those things were kind of our focus when we were meeting before lockdown.
Yeah.
And
good repertoire.
So yeah, and those are all.
Sorry, what was the third one? Haydn, Janacek. What was the other one?
Mendelssohn.
Mendelssohn. Yeah.
Yes, and we've been doing the Mendelssohn a lot in our NCM as well. So that's been going for a while. But we would like to start a Mozart quartet, and the choices are D minor, number 15, or The Hunt, and I think we're leaning towards the D minor one, and that would be on the repertoire for Trondheim. Yeah,
well, I think that's a good. I mean, the other thing to say is play what you love. I mean, there's such a huge repertoire that competitions apart. It's not really necessary to twist anyone's arm to play a piece that they're not in love with. Because if there are certain composers or certain pieces that one of you is not that keen on, then you probably won't need to get around to them for the first 40 years, because there's so much other stuff. So do what you love, because it gives you enthusiasm. It gives you, and personally, if you ask me D minor or the Hunt, I would go for the D minor any day. In fact, I mean, the Hunt's it's probably my least favorite of the 10 great Mozart quartets, because I find the first two movements somewhat problematic, actually. I find them rather square, and it just keeps. I mean, I mean, there are ways of playing it and trying to mitigate it, but it doesn't seem to me his most inspired writing. Whereas the D minor is just, you know, one of the greatest of the 10. So I would, but this is a matter of taste. I mean, there's no. But if that's what you're choosing anyway, I'm glad to hear it.
Yeah, we're definitely leaning towards that.
Yeah, and then I think we'd like to play 2 Beethoven quartets. One from Opus 18, number 3,
very good,
D major, and Opus 59, number 2.
Brilliant choice.
So those 2 we're set on learning.
Yeah, I'd like to work with you on 59 too. Because
that's great.
I think it's a very. I think there's so much about quartet playing and about quartet composition, actually, and quartet and the structure of the piece, which is encapsulated in 59-2. I mean, I'm happy to work with all the pieces you've mentioned, but I think 59-2 is a very strong piece. For Beethoven, by the way, I would make sure you're playing off Bärenreiter, or at least that you're using the Bärenreiter scores. Because it's edited by Jonathan Delmar, and it completely supersedes Henley, which we were all using Henley until recently. But there are lots of differences, and I mean, some of them are quite small. 1 or 2 of them are very big, but there's no doubt that Jonathan's. I mean, I mean, I don't know if it'll ever be superseded unless more sources come along, which is always possible. But he's such a fanatic, and he's such a kind of nerdy editor. I mean, nothing escapes him. A single dot wrong, he makes them reprint the whole thing because they put a dash instead of a slur or something, and so it is incredibly accurate. And then he gets incredibly upset if he realizes that a mistake has been printed, and can't wait for them to do another edition. So it's an incredible scholarly achievement, the Bärenreiter Beethoven. I mean, just about he's done all the symphonies, he's done the piano sonatas, he's done concertos, he's done loads of Beethoven, so he's incredibly experienced. I mean, he's talked to me a lot about issues which arose. So I think that's important, just to start off on the right foot, because otherwise you've got to start changing things.
That's so good to know.
Yeah, it is useful to know. I mean, with Mendelssohn, are you playing off Henley?
Yes.
I think that's probably the right thing. And Mozart?
I think we've just bought the Bärenreiter of the Mozart.
I think that's the best there is. I think each composer has a different editor. So Bärenreiter great for Beethoven, they're terrible for Schubert. And it's just because the different person's in charge of it. And
wow.
And what about Haydn?
Haydn, we actually got the the Simon Rowland Jones Peters edition. I
think that's pretty good. That one or Henley?
Yeah.
It might be worth looking at both, but
yeah,
I think that's good enough. Yeah. Okay, carry on.
Then we also, sorry, I missed one out before. We worked on Schubert's Death and the Maiden as well.
Good.
That was a kind of like, we had left RNCM and we thought, let's just take on a challenge and go for it. and it was great, and it was really, really. But we've kind of put that on the back bench now because the Beethoven, I think, is the biggest project.
Yeah.
And then when we were at RNCM, we played Bartok 3.
Right.
And that's one that we'd like to keep in our repertoire and learn it with Abby as soon as possible as well.
Yeah, right.
And I think that was everything. We also discussed potentially doing a different Mendelssohn, seeing as we've been doing the A minor one for a while now.
Right.
But
have you got one in mind?
Yes, it's F minor.
Right. Yeah.
And
the only thing is that, I mean, the F minor is it's a great, great piece. It's very desperate and minory as a sort of last piece. And the A minor, which you've done, is a young piece, but it's also very tragic. And if you want more of a contrast, I would suggest the D major, the 44 number 1, which is incredibly joyful and also a great piece. I mean, it just depends. For programs, sometimes, I mean, you need to balance keys and you need to balance composers and styles and so on, but you need to balance moods. I notice, I mean, I think my tastes are very similar to yours because all the pieces you've mentioned, there's a lot more. I've noticed, like my moods, that they're all a bit minory. I mean, you've got Death from the Maiden, D minor, and a tragic piece. I mean, they're most of them tending to tragedy, and the Janacek and the Bartok are not a barrel of laughs either. So
yeah, I hadn't thought of that.
So it might be an idea to have a joyful piece in there.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
So that you're not offering 3 tragic pieces.
Yeah.
when it comes to, I mean, I'm not thinking of competitions, but I'm thinking of concerts.
Yeah,
yeah.
true.
I guess the Haydn Opus 76
was
the most joyful that we had. But
absolutely.
No, but that's yeah. Apart from that, I think that was it, wasn't it?
Well, I think that's great
no.
and central and fundamental repertoire. I mean, the Janacek's great. It's not fundamental in the sense that it's so, the style is so unique that what you learn from playing that doesn't relate very much to any other quartet because it's just out there on its own. There are pieces like that, but it's great to have it. So you've got only one 20th century piece.
Yes.
So we've got Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, Mendelssohn,
Bartok, and Janacek.
So, and Janacek. So maybe you need a different sort of 20th century piece and a romantic, a slightly more romantic Schumann or Brahms or something. To think about those. I mean, I think the Schumann quartets are wonderful. I mean, probably the greatest is the third one, which everybody does, but the other 2 are also wonderful.
Yes.
And the Brahms, I slightly feel playing them that Brahms is more comfortable writing for sextet and quintet, actually. I mean, he's struggling to get everything into a string quartet. I mean, the way Haydn is utterly comfortable writing quartets, and Mozart's probably, apart from the D minor, is probably more comfortable in the viola quintet repertoire. Haydn and Beethoven are absolutely centrally comfortable in the quartet. So Brahms, I don't know. I think you could wait. I would do Schumann before Brahms.
Okay.
Yeah, we were discussing that recently, actually, about Schumann quartets. Yes, so we'd be on board with that, I'm sure.
And then the other thing is, you're a British quartet, and if you start going abroad, people quite often ask for British works. So I don't know if you like them at all, but I would think about one of the Britain quartets.
Yeah, that's
in
what I
terms
want.
of central repertoire, which you'd be asked to play a lot, both here and there. And all three, I mean, they're very, very different, but they're all terrific. I mean, especially the second and the third, I think. And I mean, there are quite a few pieces of that sort of era. I mean, Walton is quite interesting. Tippett ranges from early Tippett to quite late Tippett. I really like the second Tippett. Although I must say, if I had to choose one or two pieces, I would choose probably Britain of the English quartets. And then there are some slightly obscure names like Alan Bush, who actually wrote some terrific pieces. And of course, there's Tom Addis. There are two so far, and probably more to come. And they're pretty major. And yeah, quite a lot of other writers.
What about Elgar Quartet?
Yeah, I think if you love it, do it. I mean, I think it is a great piece. It doesn't travel very well.
Yeah.
I mean, people abroad are not going to ask for it, and if they hear it, they're not going to like it. I don't know why. I don't understand why.
Yeah,
I really don't. I mean, same with the piano quintet, which is a masterpiece, but they're both masterpieces. But it doesn't travel well, and it didn't. In the end, it was something we didn't use very much. But I mean, it's good to have a piece to champion. You know, if you really, really believe in it and you really, really love it, and you really try and do it. I would say it's kind of the next round. I'm not sure I would. I think I would do Britain before I did the Elgar, because you'll get more value, you'll get more use.
Yeah.
Of it, I
well, we our name Emmeline comes from Emmeline Pankhurst.
Oh, right.
And the women's suffragette movement, and we thought that would be a nice kind of theme somehow to you know, if we female composers, for example, or
I mean, there are
something related.
Yeah. I mean, there are. I heard recently on the radio a couple of really interesting quartets by female composers. I mean, there are a lot you could look at. You've got to be absolutely clear about it. I mean, I think you've got to love the pieces and feel they've been neglected, rather than look, they're very good, but they happen to be by women, and we're championing that, because that's not going to go down well. I mean, that's a historical thing. But there are, I think you'll find them. And in terms of contemporary music, I mean, there are lots of women composers who are major.
Yeah.
Goodbye to Lena, for instance, has written some great stuff. And McConkey, well, she's not alive, but I mean, she's recent, wrote about a dozen excellent quartets, really, really good ones.
With starting a new program with like lots of new repertoire, how would you recommend rehearsing it? Is it kind of do everything at once, or kind of do a few weeks on one piece and then move on? Or
I think that's temperamental. I mean, we liked to jump from one thing to another, so that we didn't get too bogged down in one piece, and it was a relief to sort of move on. But also, I think we were always combining learning a new piece or two with actually polishing and revising something that was we get getting ready for concerts, because we were always having concerts. But I think that was very good for us, because you need to be raising your top level all the time, at the same time as learning new things. And if there's too much learning, especially contemporary things, you're not sort of honing your playing of different styles and at the highest level. I mean, in many ways, when we have coaching sessions, I think it'd be much more useful if we work together on pieces which are your party pieces, which you feel you really know how to play and it's good and you're ready, it's concert ready. Because if I can if I'm able to open any windows and raise the level of your top level, that's going to do you much more good than if I help you at the early stages of learning a piece when you would get it much better yourselves anyway. And I might be able to make some shortcuts for you and save you a bit of time. But much more useful if, if you play 7-6-1 fantastically, and then I can get you to play it super fantastically, because that's going to go into, that will feed into everything else you do, I think. And I think it's much more useful. So, I mean, bear that in mind if we do 59-2 or whatever. I'd like to hear it as a finished product, and if not, we could do 7-6-1 or one of the other pieces that you do. And I think also when we work together, we shouldn't think too much about competition and aiming for deadlines and so on, because it's best to be just free. And if we want to spend 2 hours on one line or one phrase, then let's do it. Because and that is also part of raising the level, raising the whole level. So yeah, that's just to bear in mind.
Yeah,
but I don't think you can make a rule for a group about whether it's best to just learn one piece at a time, get it to a high level, and then take the next one. I think that's your temperament. I mean, my colleagues got quite itchy feet quite quickly, and they would want to jump around to different movements in the same piece, but well before we'd got it sorted. But we'd sort of felt we'd made a certain progress, and now let's play something else.
The kind of main point that we've been focusing on recently is being aware of harmony. And so that was what we mentioned to Richard, was our kind of next focus, to delve deep into that. And yeah, we've been calling often these days and just discussing the scores together and practicing together. And so that's kind of where we're all at the moment.
If you want to have a session with me just looking at a score of 59-2,
we would absolutely love.
That might be quite fruitful. I mean, once you've had a good look at it yourselves. For instance, I mean, let me ask you a question about 59-2 that you can think about when you there's a kind of how can I put it? There's grit in the oyster. There's something there which is in all 4 movements, which creates the harmonic tension on a structural level. And basically you could boil it down to one note. So maybe have a think about what that is, and find where it is in all movements. It's the key. I mean, to me, it's the key argument of the piece, in a way, to put it in a rather unemotional and sort of logical way. But also, you could also think about what's the emotional impact of this grit in the oyster. And how does it play out? How does that story get developed throughout the piece?
Oh, okay.
That's your homework. But I think it's a great thing if you're doing that, if you're studying scores together online, because I think you can save masses of time. But of course, there's a million different ways of studying a score. There isn't an analysis of a piece. There are thousands of analyses of a piece, depending on what sort of questions you're asking and what aspects of it you're interested in. I think what gets neglected a lot is texture. I mean, I'm no expert on it. I have a very poor basic academic training, and I never studied music in any formal way at all. I did something different at university and so I've just sort of picked up stuff here and there. And I've learned a lot from listening to various Hungarian teachers who are steeped in, Budapest Academy integration of harmonic thought and performance in a wonderful way. I mean, people like Ferenc Rados, who's taught for Chamber Studio a few times. I've lost my thread now. What was I saying? Oh yes. So I mean, harmony is important. But texture is. I've only read a little bit of an analysis, and there's very little about. I mean, one thing, for instance, I think it's important to notice where is there ostinato and where isn't there. Ostinato is where you've got some kind of rhythmic, motoric impulse going on, because it comes and goes in a piece, and I think it's incredibly significant when it stops and when it starts, because it gives a sense of movement, and then there's a sense of stasis when it's not there. And I think the great composers, is very obvious in at least the classical style, in Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, where it stops and where it starts, but it seems to be very little commented upon. And I think just as players, the sense of the music here is forward looking and the music here becomes backward looking, reflective. Not necessarily that you slow down or you speed up, but just as a sense of maybe you're on the front of the tempo or the back of the tempo or within exactly the same tempo, just a sense of thinking forward, and the other is kind of looking behind you. I mean, that's just one example. Another example is, I mean, I'm just thinking, for instance, in Death and the Maiden, there's one pizzicato note in the cello part in the first movement, which happens again in the recap. Why is that note pizzicato? And why only one? Well, not why only one, but I mean, what does being pizzicato give you? What does it mean? What's it there for? I mean, that sort of question, which is not, you won't read about in any book on analysis, as far as I know. But as performers, we need to sort of think, because that tells us how to play it.
One thing we had recently was in Haydn and Mendelssohn especially was, for example, sforzando or accent or any of these markings.
Yeah.
And we were exploring how we can, because we would play it and we would see the marking sforzando and we'd be, oh, now I have to make a sforzando.
Yeah.
And we were trying to think, how can you, like you said, why is there a sforzando? Why did the composer write it on this specific note or chord?
Yes.
And to not play it like it's a marking.
No, absolutely right. That's absolutely right. It shouldn't be something that's external, that's imposed on your interpretation. You just do it because you see it there, as if you've got a sort of box of paints, and one of them is marked Metz 14, and one of them is marked sforzando, and one of them is marked Dolce, and so on. And you see it in the score, and then you just paint it on, because that's really not going to work. So I mean, you're obviously on the right lines. I mean, the context has to tell you everything about what sforzando means here in this particular place. And first of all, every composer uses these signs differently. There's not a common meaning. And secondly, nearly every composer changes the way they use them through their life. So what Beethoven means by sforzando in the late period is not necessarily the same as the early period, insofar as it means anything very much. But mostly in that, I mean, they do have a limited symbolism of signs, I should say. So it's not a paint box, but they've just got a few letters on the typewriter, and that's what they're limited to. So they're desperately trying to send a message to us performers, but with a very limited set of signs. So they're using things for multiple purposes, I would say. And we have to find from the context what it is. So very often all you know is that there's some sort of emphasis of some sort on the note, or maybe it's the group of notes where the sforzando is. But it doesn't mean it's a kind of vertical digging into the string, or that it's or even that it's louder necessarily, or anything like that. It's just some sort of emphasis. So it could be more vibrato, it could be a faster bow. It could sometimes in the repeat actually be softer, but it just draws attention to that note. It could be digging into the string or nearer the bridge, but I would say it doesn't have to be louder. And how sharp it is and how much die away and how much sustained is really going to depend on the phrase and the context. And also I would think be very aware of sorry? Be very aware of the difference between a dynamic which is in some ways structural and a dynamic which is local. So sometimes a dynamic comes and it's a really major step. We've had a big modulation, it's a new feeling, it's a new melody, and that's what the dynamic's about. Sometimes it's just a little bit of local color that the composer is saying, I don't want you to phrase on the bar to the bar line, I want you to phrase to this note instead. This is the the main note phrase in terms of phrasing in the phrase, which means very little dynamic, if any, contrast. But then one has to know a little bit about each composer's habits. I mean, for instance, Beethoven, interestingly, for some reason, between forte and fortissimo, he never writes a crescendo. So between piano and forte, you write crescendo. And if he wants more crescendo, what he puts is più forte. But he doesn't, I mean, I think there are only about 2 or 3 examples in his whole output where he writes crescendo between forte and fortissimo, and one can discuss why he uses those in that case. But why he has this habit, I don't know. So più forte does not mean it's like terrace dynamics, that here it's louder than here it's louder again. And I very much suspect it's the same in Mendelssohn. And then between piano and pianissimo, he doesn't write diminuendo, he writes più piano. So it's good to know this so that you don't start playing in terraces. And these are the sort of things which you gradually figure out by seeing more and more and more of the works. So, one of the best ways of, after a certain point of learning Haydn 76.1 is to learn another 30 Haydn quartets. Because when you've done that and you have a context in which to see this particular piece, it's very different from when that's the only piece of Haydn that you play. You have no idea what the context is, what's an unusual marking and what's normal for him. So some composers, I mean, they do have their own language. I think there's a hierarchy of accents in Schumann, for instance. I mean, the sforzando, forte piano, hat accent that way, the diminuendo accent, all those 4 or 5 ways of saying an accent line. I think there is a hierarchy of forcefulness in them. And there probably is in a lot of composers, but one has to kind of tease it out. So I think it's always work in process what the notation means. And one mainly has to tease it out from the context and then try and remember what it meant in that case and whether it means the same thing. But for instance, a dagger, as we call it in Mozart or in Beethoven. I mean, Stephen Nislis once told me, he came off the platform, he was playing with Bob Levins and Beethoven's notes, and he said, I finally figured out what a dagger means. It either means more, or it means less, or it means shorter, or it means longer.
Great.
And I think that's right. I mean, there are definitely cases in the Mozart quartets where adagio means to de-accent it. I mean, it couldn't possibly be an accent on that note. But there are other cases where it must mean to stress that note. So it's not, in a way, telling us very much. It's just some message from the composer to those who try and understand that there's something or other here. And I think one can't ignore the markings, but one has to interpret each one. And I think in terms of phrasing, phrase lengths, harmony, the harmony of phrases, the big structural harmony, where the stresses of the phrase are, that's really to do with, I mean, phrasing for me is not mainly to do with, it's partly to do with what notes belong together and what notes need to be separated, which sometimes is shown in the slurring, but it's much more than that. It's to do with where is the main stress and where not. And with long notes, what's their shape? Do they die away or do they grow to the next note? And do they dip in the middle? Do they rise in the middle? And how do we do those dyings away and rises and so on? And I would say what is very underused by most string players are two things. I mean, first of all, bow speed variety. So that I mean, on the whole, I wouldn't do a dying away on a note by releasing pressure or coming away from the bridge, because that's too big a deal. You should just use that for big changes of color. But by the bow starting fast and just slowing down in a natural way. And on the other hand, if the note blossoms, if you want it to grow, then start the bow slowly and it goes faster. And then the left hand should go with that. So the vibrato is neither continuous nor is it not there at all, but it's part of the phrase. So it's as the bow goes faster, because the note's blossoming, the vibrato can start contained and then it can free up so that it helps the bow to blossom, and vice versa. The vibrato can calm down if the note's dying away. So I think if you do less change in the fundamental bow contact and more changes in the speed and the vibrato, I mean, for most people that opens up worlds of possibilities. No, I haven't heard you play, so I don't know. You might know all this already. You might be doing it already, but I often find people could do much more of that. And in terms of deciding what an accent means, that also increases your possibilities, because it just might mean more bow speed here, less bow speed there, vibrate on this note, because vibrato was not as continuous as we do it. So in Schumann, you know, an accent can be just vibrate on this note, or in our terms, vibrate more on this note than the others, perhaps, and nothing much more than that, like an espressiva written over a note, something like that.
In the piece which has both sforzandos and accents, and if we think that the sforzandos and the accents are different depending on the context, does that mean that there'll be kind of overlaps of when an accent and a sforzando are played in the same way, or are they completely, like, two completely different things?
I think there are probably overlaps, but I don't know. We'd have to look at a specific piece. I mean, it's a good question. I mean, one would like to think that the composer is logical and that he uses two different signs to mean two different things. But whether that's always true, I'm not at all sure. Plus the fact that, of course, some editions are wildly inaccurate, so one is interpreting some mistake or some editor rather than the actual composer. I mean, that's why it's very important to have good editions. So at least when we're wrestling with the marking, we're wrestling actually with the composer's marking and not someone else's marking, because that really is a waste of time to be doing that. So Barenreiter Schubert is full of rubbish. It's just full of rubbish. I mean, and you don't need to wrestle with those markings. Yeah, what else?
Just when we I guess get back together and rehearse again, just wondering if you had any like sort of exercises or anything you'd recommend for just like intonation in general? I know it's probably the classic thing.
Yeah, it's the classic thing. Well, about intonation in general, make sure. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. No, you go.
Make
Sorry.
sure that you take in when you're trying to tune a troublesome chord. Make sure you're not just moving the left hand up and down, the fingers up and down. Make sure that the sonority and the balance and the blend is a part of your attempt to find the intonation. Because if I'm doing intonation with you and I'm playing on the bridge and you're playing on the fingerboard, and I'm doing a wide slow vibrato and you're doing a narrow fast vibrato, nothing is going to sound in tune, because intonation is so intimately connected with sonority and also with balance. I mean, if the third is miles too loud in the chord, for instance, it's going to sound sharp, and wherever you move the fingers, it's not going to help, because it's the balance that's wrong, not just the place where the fingers are. So there's one thing in general to bear in mind. So, I mean, so I would do, in terms of a piece, I mean, I would do a certain amount of slow practice, really listening carefully, but I would do it in the sonority, so that you're phrasing and shaping and doing dynamic that you would do anyway, but just slowly enough so that you can really hear the intonation, rather than doing it in a kind of regulation mezzo forte where no one is shaping, phrasing. And that's quite easy to get us in tune, and then suddenly you play it and it doesn't sound in tune anymore. That's partly because the emotional commitment comes and gets in the way of the intonation, but it's also partly because the balance and everything changes. So what you've practiced is not really relevant. I mean, if you want, you can do it in 2 stages. If you feel it helps you to do the kind of mezzo forte blank version, do. But then before you, and then do a next stage, which is to stay slow, but do it with all the sonority. I think in terms of actual exercises, I've never sort of done much of that sort of thing, but there are 2 or 3 things. We did 2 things. We would play scales in octaves, slowly, balancing to one particular instrument. So we might ask, say, viola to play really firmly and slightly more loud than everybody else, and we all try and balance to the viola, sort of tune to the viola, and then to the cello, and then to the first one, and whatever. The other thing is, I used to like practicing cadences. So just do, 4-5-1 or whatever, changing the voicing a little bit. You find, say, dominant sevenths are often quite troublesome, and so 4-5-5-7-1 or something like that, because they're everywhere, and you at least want to be really in tune when you get to your cadence. And the other thing, I know the Belcher did this, and they have terrific intonation, I'm sure it's good, is to play Bach chorales.
Yeah.
Because it's so, it's the fundaments of harmony, really. And I think one has to learn how tempered and non-tempered to play. I had to learn to play a little bit more tempered than I was used to playing when I started playing quartets, because playing a melody line, you can be less tempered. In fact, you need to be less tempered. Playing a bass line, you can't afford to, say, sharpen your leading notes or flatten six as much as if you're playing that note in the melody line. And I think the poor middle parts, I don't know which of you play what, but the poor middle parts, really, sometimes you have to play notes which, if you just stop and listen to what you're doing individually, it sounds dreadfully out of tune, but it's the only way to fit into the chord. Which is upsetting, but I think that's the only way. I think the other thing is to don't get too obsessed with vertical intonation. In other words, there are some things which are just obviously vertical, like the second movement of Death and the Maiden, which is sort of chorale-like. and the intonation is so vertical. But most quartet writing is in lines. There are 2 or 3 lines, and maybe, well, there's sometimes one line and then a subsidiary line and then a bit of accompaniment and someone else is a rest or is just playing like in thirds or sixths with one of the lines, so I count as one line. I think sometimes there's a tug between the intonation requirements of the melody, which likes things to be very not tempered. So, sharpened leading notes, sharpened major thirds, sometimes flattened minor thirds, and flattened minor sixths, flattened minor seconds, that sort of thing. Because the melody sort of demands it, requires it, it's natural for us to do it. And on the other hand, if you stop and you're playing too slowly and you hear that in the vertical situation, it sounds out of tune. But if you tune everything vertically, then it's going to sound out of tune when you play to that speed, and the melodies will suffer. So I would say the main melody, and maybe the subsidiary melody as well, should feel right within themselves. So if there's a little bit of tug against the vertical, unless you're landing on a chord and sitting there for long enough that everybody can hear it clearly, then better to go with the melodic. But you have to kind of decide that. But the danger of a lot of slow chord practice is that it ruins your melodic intonation. Yeah. And actually, it doesn't sound in tune to the audience, even though if they were to take a snapshot of each chord, it would be very in tune.
Oh wow! Okay.
So it's tricky. It's tricky. I mean, intonation's full of compromises. Like, if you've tuned your perfect fifth, and between the D and the A string you play an E, then if it's a perfect fourth with the A above it, it's going to be miles too high as a sixth for the G below it. And so there's already a compromise there.
Mm.
And that's in the context. One other tip for tuning is, maybe it only applied to us, but we used to have trouble with the flat keys. So we played better in tune in sharp keys than we did in F major, B flat, E flat. Those keys caused us trouble. And in the end, we realized the tonic we were setting too low. So if we were in E flat, we were basically tuning it, finding the E flat tonic by tuning up from the C string. And that meant it was low to the G string. And because again, it's like the other example, if it's a slightly nice, non-tempered, slightly flat minor third, then it's going to be too wide between the E flat and the G. So we tended to just raise the tonic more than we had been doing with all the flat keys. So B flat would feel a little bit sharp to the open G string, but it felt pretty much right to the open D string. I mean, again, a slight compromise, but more in that direction. Just a slightly brighter tonic in relation to the strings on the instrument. And it seemed to help us a lot to do that in playing in those keys. I'm not sure in your repertoire you've had much of that yet.
Just a lot of flats in Janacek.
There's a lot, yeah, but Janacek's slightly different anyway. But I mean, you haven't had a classical piece in a flat key yet, so it hasn't written. Maybe certain movements I can't remember. But I mean, D minor is different because in the minor, well, D is the tonic and the minor third is there. So anyway, just bear that in mind.
That's really interesting.
It's just another of those balances between, intonation is all a balance. I would also say don't get too hung up on it, and don't spend an hour. I mean, I would say if you really concentrate hard, don't do more than 10 minutes or a quarter of an hour at a time, and then just move on. And maybe don't stop at every single note. Sometimes it's just like cleaning your ears out. If you playing a line even though you know something's out of tune, just keep going and just get it better and better and better, rather than stop and stop. And if something in a piece is always troublesome, you know, whenever you land on that chord, it never feels right, then examine it, you know, individually. And the other thing is, there's no point doing quartet intonation in lots of detail if your individual intonation is not right. So, I mean, very often the problem is simply that one person is playing something out of tune, and that's for them to fix. And there's no point wasting quartet time on if someone's struggling with a particular passage, then let them work on the individual passage. So the only point of doing the quartet intonation is when you play individually, it all sounds really in tune, but when you play together, it doesn't. And then that's a classic sort of quartet intonation issue.
Yeah. I guess that's what's been quite interesting about this time since Christmas, where we've just been doing our own practice.
Yes, yeah.
So much on quartet repertoire and discussing it. It's been like really interesting.
Yeah, it's probably very good for you, because most people don't practice anything like enough individually.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the other thing. Make sure you don't spend so much time rehearsing that you have no time to practice. And not only practice, but I would say you should all do try and just do recitals and stuff. So you're playing sonatas, solo repertoire, or Bach, or recitals, or whatever. I don't know who plays what, as I say, but I mean, the first violin parts are quite taxing, but the other three parts are not really, I mean, they're difficult, but they're not stretching you as much as, you know, playing most sonatas, except that you'll suddenly have a bit which is really difficult, having sat there playing easy stuff for quarter note. You suddenly have a horrific passage at the top of the instrument, which you have to just get straight into that mode without warming up, as it were. And that's actually very challenging. It's quite difficult to do that. So if you're in the swing of playing, you know, more difficult repertoire anyway, because you're doing the odd sonata recital, or concerto, or whatever it is, then do it. But don't become a kind of professional quartet player in the sense that all you ever practice is the parts.
Okay.
And especially if you're not first violin. I mean, first violin, you know, it's quite stretchy anyway. But I would say even for first violin, because it's a different form of projection, and it frees you up in a way playing with the piano as opposed to playing with quartet. For first violin, is because you do more your own thing, and certainly intonation wise. The same issues of intonation apply with playing with the piano. I mean, I don't like to play with the piano in a tempered way, even though the piano can't adjust and the piano is tempered. To my ear, even though vertically it's not right, I sound better if I'm sharpening my leading notes, even